They thought I was just the help, a nameless shadow drifting through the ballroom with a tray of champagne. They had no idea that while they were busy plotting my destruction, I was busy orchestrating their absolute ruin. The air inside the gala of the year was thick enough to choke on. It was a cocktail of expensive cologne, desperation, and the kind of artificial politeness that only comes from people who measure their self-worth by their stock portfolio. I was standing near the edge of the grand ballroom, draped in a white tuxedo vest and carrying a tray of chilled champagne that cost more than most people make in a month. To the guests, I was just part of the furniture, a nameless silhouette blending into the shadows of the marble pillars. I've spent the last 6 months undercover in my own company, and honestly, it's been the most enlightening experience of my life. My name is Julian Thorne, and for those who bother to check the Forbes list, I'm the man currently holding the reins of a global tech empire. But here in this room, I was just the help. I watched the sharks circle. I watched the CEOs of my rival firms whisper about hostile takeovers and liquidating assets, thinking they were being clever. Little did they know, their entire roadmap to destroying me was resting on a silver platter I was currently holding. The trouble started when a group of high-level board members from my own subsidiary decided they'd had enough of waiting for me to step down. They were the architects of an organized scheme designed to funnel company funds into their own offshore accounts. They treated me like a prop in their little play. One of them, Marcus, a man whose ego was as inflated as his debt, snapped his fingers in my face so hard the air whistled. "Hey, you," he barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "The ice in this glass is melting. Get me a fresh one and make it snappy. I've got a multi-billion-dollar acquisition to discuss, and your incompetence is making me thirsty." I kept my head down, offering a practiced, subservient nod. "Right away, sir. My apologies." I walked to the bar, my mind racing. Marcus was the ringleader of the group that had been trying to frame me for a series of phantom crimes. They had been planting evidence in my private office, trying to link me to restricted financial transactions, and even fabricating claims that I was dealing with illegal goods. They wanted to hit me with a charge of attempted life-ruining criminal activity. They were banking on the idea that if they could create enough chaos, the board would force me out, and they would step in to save the company. They didn't know that the internal security team, the real one, not the puppets they'd bribed, had been recording every conversation, every illicit agreement, and every signature they'd forged. I returned with the fresh glass, my expression carefully blank. Marcus grabbed it without looking at me, his gaze locked on his co-conspirators. "Once we force him out, we'll move the assets to the offshore shell company. If the internal security check starts digging, we'll just drop the evidence we've planted. We'll make it look like he was running an organized operation to bypass international trade laws. He'll be lucky to get away with only 20 years. With the evidence we've set, he'll be looking at an enormous term in prison." His friend, a woman named Sarah with ice-cold eyes, laughed. "It's too easy. The board is already paranoid. A few more leaked emails about the illegal cargo manifests, and Julian will be finished. He's nothing but a glorified trust fund brat. He won't even see the trap until the authorities are kicking down his door." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of their treason. They weren't just talking about a hostile takeover. They were talking about systematically destroying a life I had spent decades building. And they were doing it right in front of me, thinking I was nothing more than an invisible servant who couldn't possibly understand the weight of their words. I felt the weight of the small, encrypted recording device hidden in my vest pocket. It contained everything. Every detail of their plan, every mention of the fake documents, and every admission of their intent to frame me. I had enough leverage to ensure that not only would they never hold a board seat again, but they would be the ones facing the enormous term they so glibly discussed for me. Marcus turned his head suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. I hadn't moved away fast enough. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory whisper. "You've been standing there a long time, waiter. Are you waiting for a tip or are you just thick in the head?" I said, "Get lost." I looked him straight in the eye for the first time that night. I didn't blink. I didn't shrink back into the shadows. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of the subservience I'd been feigning. "I'm not waiting for a tip, Marcus. I'm waiting for the moment you realize that the person you've been insulting for the last hour is the only person in this room who can decide if you wake up tomorrow in your mansion or in a federal holding cell." The room seemed to go silent. The music faded into the background, and the other board members slowly turned, their expressions shifting from irritation to sudden, sharp confusion. Marcus's face drained of color, his hand trembling slightly as he held the glass. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I took a step toward him, the power dynamic in the room shifting violently in a single heartbeat. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, the notification that my chief of security had successfully intercepted their digital handoff. The game was over. I smiled, a genuine, cold smile, and leaned in close to his ear. "By the way, that glass you're holding? It's not just water. It's evidence." Marcus froze, the glass in his hand vibrating slightly against his knuckles. The arrogance that had defined his posture just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a sudden, frantic realization. He looked at the crystal tumbler as if it were a primed explosive, then back at me, his eyes darting toward his fellow conspirators. Sarah, however, didn't miss a beat. She stood up, her expensive silk gown rustling like a serpent, and stepped between Marcus and me. "Are you insane?" she hissed, her voice a razor-sharp whisper. "You've clearly been drinking, or perhaps the stress of your menial life has finally snapped your mind. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? We're the board of directors. We can have you fired, blacklisted, and erased from this industry before the morning sun hits the skyline." I didn't move. I simply adjusted the white napkin draped over my arm, my posture shifting from that of a waiter to someone who was suddenly the most dangerous person in the room. "The board of directors is currently undergoing a mandatory restructuring," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that made the people at nearby tables stop their conversations and lean in. And as for being erased, that's a fascinating choice of words, considering that's exactly what the service logs and the digital audit trails are currently doing to your careers. I saw Marcus's color return, but it wasn't the healthy glow of a man in power. It was the flush of a cornered animal. He looked around the ballroom, desperately scanning for security, but my internal team, men and women I had personally vetted, were already positioned at every exit. They weren't there to serve drinks. They were there to ensure that when the internal security review began, no one left the premises without a full statement. "You're bluffing," Marcus spat, though his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier bullying. "You're a server, a low-level employee. You don't have access to the internal network. You don't have the clearance to pull logs. You're just a pawn who's about to be discarded." I reached into my breast pocket, not for a tip, but for the tablet I'd been keeping synced to the ballroom's Wi-Fi network. I tapped the screen and instantly, the massive projection screen at the front of the stage, the one reserved for the CEO's keynote presentation that was supposed to happen in 20 minutes, flickered to life. Instead of the polished corporate branding and growth projections, the screen displayed a real-time feed of the encrypted server logs. It showed the exact timestamps of their offshore transfers, the file names of the forged documents, and a series of audio transcripts that were currently being uploaded to the primary regulatory oversight portal. The ballroom erupted into a symphony of gasps and whispers. The other guests, high net worth investors and potential partners, were staring at the screen in horror. They saw names they recognized, Marcus, Sarah, and the rest of their pathetic little cabal, attached to columns of red text labeled fraud and embezzlement. "I told you," I said, my voice cutting through the rising tide of panic. "I am not the help. I am the one who built this floor you're standing on, and I'm the one who decides when the party ends." Marcus lunged at me, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't care about the cameras, the witnesses, or the social ruin anymore. He just wanted to silence the man who had pulled the rug out from under his feet. He lunged for my throat, his hands outstretched like claws. But he was clumsy, blinded by his own fury, and I had spent the last year in a rigorous training program specifically for moments like this. I sidestepped his charge with the fluid ease of a dancer. As he stumbled past me, I didn't strike him back. I simply tripped his leading foot with the edge of my shoe. He went down hard, the expensive marble floor meeting his face with a sickening, audible crack. The room fell deathly silent. Sarah screamed, or perhaps it was someone else, it didn't matter. The chaos I had anticipated was beginning to unfold. My security team moved in, closing the perimeter around the conspirators. But just as I thought I had secured the upper hand, the lights in the grand ballroom flickered and died. A thick artificial fog began to pour from the ceiling vents, a fire suppression chemical agent, obscuring everything in a blinding white haze. Through the muffled shouting and the sound of heavy boots hitting the floor, I heard the unmistakable click of a weapon's safety being disengaged. It wasn't one of my guards. It was a professional. Someone who knew exactly where I was standing, even through the smoke. A voice, cold and detached, crackled through the intercom system, overriding the ballroom soundboard. "Julian Thorne," the voice echoed, distorted and robotic. "You were right to be cautious about your board members, but you were terribly wrong to think they were the only ones gunning for you. Drop the tablet, step away from the center of the room, or we make sure this entire building becomes your final monument." I stood in the dark, the weight of the tablet heavy in my hand, listening to the sound of multiple footsteps closing in on me from all sides. I realized then that Marcus and his crew weren't the masterminds. They were just the bait. And I had walked right into the kill zone. The air was thick with the chemical suppressant, tasting of metallic ash and burnt ozone. I crouched low, pressing my back against the cold, velvet-draped wall near the stage. The monument remark hung in the air, a clear indicator that whoever was behind this wasn't interested in a corporate merger. They were interested in a total wipeout. If they were willing to level a building filled with the city's elite just to get to me, it meant the data I had, the evidence that exposed the organized scheme, was worth more than any human life in this room. My earpiece, which I kept tucked deep inside my inner ear, suddenly pulsed. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency hum. "Julian," a voice crackled, my lead security officer hidden in the monitoring booth. "We've got a containment breach. They've bypassed the external locks. There are at least 6 individuals moving toward the stage. They aren't local. They're using high-grade jamming equipment." "I see them," I whispered back, my hand gripping the edge of the stage. "They aren't here for Marcus. Marcus was just the carrot on the stick. They're here for the drive." I checked the tablet one last time. The transfer was at 92%. I needed to buy them 60 seconds, or everything these people had worked to hide would remain buried under the rubble of this building. I loosened my tie, pulled off my service vest, and tossed it into the darkness. It landed with a soft thud near a potted palm. A split second later, a strobe of muzzle flashes lit up the haze. My vest was shredded in an instant by a hail of fire. They were firing high-velocity rounds, the kind that tore through steel, not just fabric. I moved in the opposite direction, slipping behind the heavy velvet curtains that lined the perimeter of the ballroom. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with the flutter of panic, but with the cold, calculated adrenaline of a man who had built an empire by outthinking his competition. I caught a glimpse of their silhouettes against the light leaking in from the emergency exits. They were tactical, moving with the precision of a military unit. These weren't corporate goons. They were hired muscle, the kind that cleaned up loose ends for the people who really pulled the strings in the global shadow economy. "Check the perimeter," one of them barked. His voice was clipped, professional, and devoid of emotion. "He's wounded or cornered. He can't have made it to the lobby yet." I had to lead them away from the guests. I could hear the panicked screams of the crowd, the sound of glass breaking, and the frantic attempts of people trying to find the exits. If I stayed here, the collateral damage would be astronomical. I grabbed a heavy champagne bottle from a nearby side table and hurled it toward the center of the ballroom. It smashed against a marble column, creating a sharp, echoing crack. The team turned instantly, their laser sights cutting through the white mist like red capillaries. I didn't wait. I lunged toward the service staircase, my feet silent on the plush carpet. I kicked the door open and sprinted down the narrow corridor, heading toward the maintenance basement. It was a labyrinth of pipes, generators, and industrial servers, my home turf. I reached the bottom, panting, and slammed the heavy fire door shut, bolting it with a mechanical deadbolt. I had exactly 30 seconds. I pulled my phone and bypassed the security protocols on the basement's fire suppression system. If I couldn't beat them with force, I would beat them with physics. I flooded the corridor with high-pressure water from the cooling tanks, turning the maintenance hall into a trap. I could hear them reaching the door. They didn't bother with the handle. A heavy industrial-grade charge was slapped against the metal. I dove behind a massive industrial cooling unit just as the door exploded inward, showering the room in sparks and twisted steel. The smoke cleared, and through the gaps in the machinery, I saw them enter. 3 of them, weapons leveled, sweeping the room with clinical coldness. But as they stepped onto the wet floor, they tripped the sensors I had hardwired into the flooring. The sprinklers didn't just rain water. They sprayed a high-viscosity, industrial-grade adhesive I'd had installed for the server room's emergency ceiling. Within seconds, their boots were glued to the floor. They stood there, swearing, struggling to lift their feet. I stood up, holding my phone like a remote trigger. "You're in my house now," I said, my voice echoing through the basement vents. The leader of the group, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, locked eyes with me. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. He reached into his jacket, not for a gun, but for a small, handheld remote. He grinned, a sick, twisted smile that sent a wave of nausea through me. "You think this is just about you, Thorne?" he hissed. "You forgot one thing. We didn't just infiltrate the building, we infiltrated your life. Check your feed." I looked down at the tablet. The display had changed. It wasn't the server logs anymore. It was a live feed of my private residence, the home where I kept my family's legacy and the core of my private servers. My phone chimed with an alert. "Unauthorized entry detected. Primary vault." My breath hitched. They hadn't come for me. They had come for the one thing I couldn't afford to lose. I tapped the screen to see the camera view, and my blood turned to ice. The vault door was swinging open, and standing inside, rifling through the physical files, was someone I had trusted more than anyone in the world. My own chief of operations. My chief of operations, Marcus, the man I'd spent 10 years mentoring, the man I'd entrusted with my deepest secrets and the very skeleton keys to my digital life, was standing there, illuminated by the cold blue light of my vault. He wasn't rushing. He was methodical, checking off files from a list on his own tablet. Behind him, 2 shadowed figures were loading hard drives into a lead-lined bag. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow could have. It wasn't just a corporate coup. It was a total disintegration of my world, executed by the person who knew exactly where the cracks were. "Surprised, Julian?" The lead mercenary in the basement grinned, his boots still fused to the adhesive-slicked floor. "You always were too busy looking at the horizon to see the snake in your own garden. You thought you were in control of the situation, but while you were playing waiter in your own ballroom, we were finishing the job at your home." I felt the ground beneath me seem to tilt. The vault wasn't just an archive of business data. It held the blueprints for the next generation of our secure infrastructure, the proprietary source code that made our firm untouchable, and, most importantly, the evidence against every powerful politician who had been on our payroll for years. If that data went public, or into the wrong hands, it wouldn't just bankrupt me. It would ignite a firestorm of accidental disappearances, high-level political scandals, and an investigation so deep and dirty it would require years to untangle. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. The mercenary laughed, a grating sound against the low hum of the basement's cooling fans. "Money is for the amateurs, Julian. We're here because you're a disruption. You were going to announce the new encryption protocol tonight, the one that would have locked out every backdoor we've built into the system. You weren't just a CEO. You were a problem that needed to be deleted from the architecture." I looked at the tablet screen again. My chief of operations had reached the final drive, the one labeled Project Apex. This was it, the master key to the encryption protocol. He paused, looking directly into the camera lens, as if he knew I was watching. He gave a slight mocking nod, pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed it against the vault's server. "Wiping the primary array," I whispered to myself. "Wait," the mercenary leader's radio crackled. A new voice, cold and feminine, cut through the static. "The target is in the basement. He's already triggered the containment. If he wipes the local cache, we have nothing to leverage against the board. Bring him up. Use whatever is necessary to force the override." The mercenaries in the room with me suddenly dropped their pretenses. One of them pulled a small, high-frequency jammer from his belt, and the effect was instantaneous. The adhesive I'd used to lock them down began to liquefy, vibrating under the intense sound waves. They were free. I didn't stick around. I turned and sprinted toward the narrow utility tunnel behind the boilers. I knew these tunnels better than anyone. I had designed the facility layout myself to include emergency exit routes that weren't on the blueprints. I scrambled over pipes and through condensation-slicked vents, my lungs burning. I popped out in the building's parking garage, the cool night air hitting my face. But it wasn't the sanctuary I expected. The entire perimeter was swarmed with black SUVs. They weren't police. They were private security units, the kind that operated in the gray space of international law. They weren't here to keep the peace. They were here to make sure no one left the scene alive. I crouched behind a support pillar, checking my phone. The signal was weak, but I had one final card to play. I initiated a remote wipe of my own, a scorched earth protocol that would fry the electronics of every device connected to our company's internal network, including the ones in my own vault. It would turn everything into useless silicon, but it would also trigger a silent alarm at the Internal Security Oversight Center, a branch of the government I had been secretly feeding information to for months. As I tapped the final command, a flashlight beam cut through the dark of the garage, pinning me to the pillar. "Don't move, Thorne," a voice shouted. I peeked around the corner. A squad of men in tactical gear was advancing, but they weren't wearing the insignia of the group that had attacked the ballroom. They wore the uniforms of the very security agency I'd been hoping to avoid, the ones I'd been playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with all year. A tall man in a dark suit stepped into the light, holding an arrest warrant that looked suspiciously like a death sentence. "Julian Thorne, you are under investigation for a series of crimes that fall under the most severe classification of state endangerment. We have evidence linking you to every illegal transaction, every forged manifest, and every breach of security that occurred tonight." He stepped closer, his eyes ice cold. "Your chief of operations has already surrendered. He's given us everything. He's claimed he was a whistleblower and that you were the mastermind behind the entire organized scheme. And because he provided us with the missing files you tried to wipe, we have more than enough to bury you for an enormous term." I stood up slowly, raising my hands. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from my personal server, bypassing the jammer because it was on a private satellite uplink. It was a video file titled, "The Real Truth." I looked at the man in the suit. "You have the files, but you don't have the context. If you take me in, that video goes live to every major news outlet in the country." He laughed, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt. "Let it go live, Thorne. No one will believe the words of a man who just tried to burn his own company to the ground to hide his tracks." He reached for me, but just as the metal clicked around my wrists, a massive, thunderous boom rocked the entire building. The floor shuddered, and a surge of black smoke began to rise from the upper levels. A second explosion followed, even more violent than the first. The man in the suit stumbled, looking up at the ceiling in horror. "What is that?" he gasped. "That," I said, a dark, dangerous calm settling over me, "is the sound of my life's work disappearing, and the sound of the whistleblower you just walked in with, realizing that he wasn't the one who actually had the keys to the kingdom." The parking garage lights flickered and died, and in the sudden, total darkness I heard the sound of heavy rotors descending. Not a police chopper, a stealth-grade extraction vehicle. And then a hand grabbed my collar from behind, dragging me toward a waiting vehicle that I hadn't summoned. The voice that whispered in my ear wasn't my chief of operations, and it wasn't a federal agent. It was someone I thought had been dead for 5 years. The figure dragging me into the shadows of the parking garage was clad in tactical gear, but it was the scent of expensive, old-fashioned pipe tobacco, a smell I hadn't encountered since my mentor's funeral that made my heart stop. We were shoved into the back of an unmarked transport van just as the ground beneath the parking garage shook again. The federal agents were left scrambling in the dark, caught between the collapsing building and the chaos of the exploding vaults. The door slammed shut, and the van lurched forward, speeding away from the epicenter of the destruction. My captor peeled off his balaclava, revealing the weathered, sharp-eyed face of Elias Thorne, my father's former partner, the man who was supposedly lost in a mountain accident years ago. "You always had a flair for the dramatic, Julian," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. "But you were reckless. You played with fire, and you nearly let the arsonist burn the whole forest down with you. Elias? I choked out, my hands still bound by the heavy cuffs. Everyone said you were dead. Why are you here? I've been watching, he replied, tapping a display on the dashboard that showed a clean, live feed of the building behind us, now engulfed in flames. I saw you trying to clean up the mess those board-level leeches made. You had the right instincts, but you underestimated the greed of the people you hired. Marcus didn't just betray you for a promotion. He was bought by the same shadow interests that have been trying to dismantle our legacy since your father died. I looked at the screen. The footage showed the federal agents scurrying like rats, their arrest warrant now worthless because the digital evidence they claimed to have against me was currently being vaporized in the fire I had triggered. The scorched earth protocol hadn't just fried the servers, it had triggered a physical thermite reaction in the vault walls, turning everything within into molten slag. The files, I said, my mind racing. The ones they took, they were fakes. Elias smirked, pulling a small thumb-sized drive from his breast pocket. When I realized Marcus was moving against you, I swapped the primary arrays before he could reach them. The drive he walked out with is a masterclass in fiction. It contains enough falsified data to make any investigation look like a circus. By the time they realize they've been chasing ghosts, we'll be 1,000 miles away, and the actual evidence, the real, incriminating truth about the organized scheme and the politicians involved, will be sitting in the inbox of every reputable investigative journalist in the hemisphere. The relief was so immense I felt physically weak. I had lost the empire, yes, and the building would be a crater by morning, but I had kept the only thing that truly mattered, my freedom and the power to strike back. What now? I asked, looking out the window at the blurred city lights as we left the chaos behind. Now? We rebuild, Elias said, his eyes fixed on the road. You've learned the hardest lesson of leadership. You can't trust the people you pay to manage your wealth. From now on, you operate from the shadows. You stay the ghost. We use the leverage we have to systematically tear down the people who tried to frame you, one by one. No lawsuits, no board meetings, just cold, hard justice. 6 months later, the headlines were a beautiful sight. The collapse of the tech giant wasn't blamed on me, but on a massive, coordinated fraud operation led by Marcus and his circle of conspirators. The investigation had turned into a political landslide. High-level officials were stepping down, board seats were being vacated, and the organized scheme that had once threatened to bury me was now the primary subject of a massive federal probe. Marcus himself was currently awaiting trial, facing a sentence of decades in a high-security facility. I sat on a balcony overlooking a quiet Mediterranean coast, holding a tablet that displayed the final, peaceful results of the liquidation of my old company. I hadn't gone back. I didn't need to. I had taken a fraction of the hidden reserves Elias had helped me secure and started a new venture, a small private firm dedicated to cybersecurity, where every employee was vetted by Elias himself and where the hierarchy was built on loyalty rather than greed. My phone chimed, a secure alert from a new, untraceable source. It was an anonymous tip about a new group trying to organize a similar scheme in the banking sector. I looked at the sunset, finished my coffee, and stood up. The game hadn't changed, and the sharks would always be circling. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a CEO, and I certainly wasn't the help. I was the one holding the board, and I was just getting started. I walked inside, leaving the door unlocked. I wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore, because I was the one casting them. The billionaire CEO who vanished had finally found his true purpose, and he was no longer playing by anyone else's rules. The story of my fall was a lie the world had bought into. The story of my return was just beginning to be written. And this time, there wouldn't be any waiters to ignore. There would only be the architects of the new order. And I was the one holding the blueprints.